Chapter 5.
Kai tried not to growl himself to sleep, what with Delan being so near and so incredibly nosy. He lay on the dragon-eaten floor because Delan had pulled rank for the bed. Despite how frustrated he was, it paled in comparison to his relief. It was hesitant, uncertain relief. It was relief mingled with humiliation, but it was still relief, like water through his sore limbs. His face stung, not truly, but the memory of that slap would always make him feel less of a man. He wasn't going to pretend he treated Jie well, but he could say for certain that she had treated him worse. Far worse. At least for now, she wouldn't tell his family where he was. Not just yet. Her delay might be all he needed to finish this mission and submit a request for transfer. If things went well here, he could have a wider range of options for where he would go next. Perhaps he would even try to find an open position in the Secret Services. It was risky, but it was probably the last place his family would think to look for him. It was too obvious, too close to home, too good a fit for his magic. Out of nowhere, an image flashed before his mind. Aranya's eyes fluttering closed, her lips parted, and for a minute there, very willing. The way she'd leaned into him, tilting her head back. It didn't matter that her face was a mottled collection of bruises and scrapes. He dragged a hand down over his own face, pulling his skin and lips into a frown, and gnawed on the inside of his cheek, his anxiety rising like an unquenchable storm. If Jie broke her word to him, it wouldn't just be Kai who paid the price. Aranya would pay it too. His fists clenched around the thin blanket atop him. He nearly groaned. This disaster just kept snowballing. And even if he hadn't kissed Aranya, it still would have been a disaster. Perhaps just a slightly smaller disaster. Delan shifted in the bed, making Kai's ears perk up, and he glanced around in the darkness. Delan gave a few sniffs, grunted, and settled back to sleep. Kai tilted his head to one side, propping himself up on his elbow. Just as he expected, light footsteps sounded close outside their door. Aranya was leaving her room. Her footsteps were soft, getting quieter the further down the hallway she got. Kai waited, his breath held for the sound to disappear completely, and for Delan's snores to resume. It didn't take long to his relief. Slowly, without making a sound, he got to his feet, caught up his tunic, debated for a wicked moment going without, and shot another look to make sure Delan was still sound asleep. Just when he was about to evanesce, he paused, tunic in hand. Was this a good idea? Or was he being an idiot? He was losing his head, just as Delan had warned. It was stupid, dumb, and so utterly enthralling. He never should have kissed Aranya. Nothing in his mind made sense anymore. He evanesced out of the room, into the hallway, snarling under his breath. This is a dragon-flaming basket of garbage. He had to be careful. Treacherous, gaping chasms awaiting him on either side of the line he walked. If he stumbled only barely, he would plunge headlong into disaster. Him, Aranya, and Delan together. He must be careful, or his family would destroy everything they hadn't destroyed already. He marched toward the stairs anyway.
Aranya eventually located the salve in Kai's saddlebags after what felt like half an hour of muttering, "Where in the Seven Valleys is that phoenix-scorched thing?" but was probably only a few minutes. It was too dark in the stables to apply it, so she took the container to the door, where a pair of lanterns poured light inside to illuminate her work, and sat on a half-eaten hay bale. When she unstoppered it, a sharp medicinal smell assaulted her nostrils. The familiar scent immediately took her back to being a small child, seated on the table in their old Suguan tenement, sniffling over a scraped knee. She remembered the crinkles around his eyes as Ye smiled gently at her, told her in a voice much stronger than the one he possessed now, "Deep breath, little sunflower. Look how brave you're being." She remembered the way the evening light cast through the lattice windows, turning the whole room orange, the way it caught on his graying hair. It was always hard to remember what he looked like years ago, but she distinctly remembered a time when his hair wasn't completely white, a time when he'd been the one taking care of her, not the other way around. Pinching her lips together too tightly, she swiped a dollop of the cool, smooth ointment. The first press of it to her raw wrist dragged a hiss from her mouth. "Let me do it." Aranya leapt up, wheeling back her arm to throw the salve at the intruder. She stopped as the voice registered in her mind. "7 Valleys, Kai!" She saw a pair of upturned hands first, as though in surrender. Then Kai emerged from the shadows of the stables and gestured to the salve, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "It's easier if someone else does it," he said, holding out a hand for the container. She immediately bristled, sitting back down even though her muscles tensed for flight. "Does Delon know you're here?" The moment the question was past her lips, she wanted to take it back. Of course Delon didn't know. Kai only raised an eyebrow. "You're devious," she said. He gave her a lopsided grin, and then, without another word, evanesced to her side, snatched the salve out of her grip, and sat next to her. "If we hurry, I might even be able to bandage them for you before Delon realizes I'm gone." She frowned, biting her lip, unsure whether she should protest further. "You should be sleeping." "Can't." "So you're just going to keep evanescing and making your insomnia worse?" He smirked at her words, even though he didn't look up. His gaze was focused downward as he gently took her left hand and swiped more of the salve with 2 fingers. "Ready? 3, 2, 1. Aranya sucked a breath in through her teeth, gripping the prickly straw with her other hand. "It stings." "I know." She grimaced as he began carefully rubbing it in. Her fingers curled at the pain. She glared at the top of his downward tilting head. To what could she attribute this sudden shift in behavior? The Kai she'd known up until now would have flung the salve in her face and told her to deal with the application on her own. He probably would have even called her a dragon runt for how she reacted to the pain. Was this his way of apologizing for earlier? It wasn't until he reached for her other hand that a memory resurfaced. She had just stomped through the forest underbrush to a clearing where a girl was mounted up on a horse, hands bound and eyes teary. The girl had stared as Kai gently consoled her, pressing his hand comfortingly to her knee. He held Aranya's hand so carefully now, mumbling soft reassurances whenever she flinched. "Almost done," he said. The realization was like a slap in the face. He was treating her like he had treated Lord Mong's daughter, the kidnapped girl they'd rescued in Sushui, like some damsel in distress to be wooed and added to his collection of admirers. She yanked her wrist back, snatched the salve out of his hand, and stood. "Thank you," she said curtly. "I'll finish the rest." Kai stood too, confusion flashing across his face. "What's wrong, Aranya?" "Not partial." She marched back to him, glaring up at his bewilderment and not caring that she barely reached his shoulder. "I'm not Jiashi, Kai. I've seen how you behave around girls, but you've always treated me differently. Until now. One kiss, and suddenly you're pulling the charm out of your pocket like I'm another one of your academy dalliances." His brow lowered, his eyes darkening even as his mouth curved up in an unamused smile. He tilted his head closer to hers, modulating his tone deeper. "Flattering ourselves, are we partial?" There it was. She flashed a grin, disregarding the curling doubt in her stomach. Perhaps she had jumped to conclusions. Perhaps he didn't think of her that way. But she couldn't back down now, especially not if she was right. "See how quickly this dissolves," she said slowly. "One minute you're crooning over my injuries, and the next you're insulting me. I've seen how you manipulate situations to get what you want, how you portray the version of yourself that people want to see. I'm not claiming to be the smartest person ever, but I can tell when you're giving me a load of false kindness." He tilted his chin upward, his eyes narrowing with each accusation. She met his glare evenly, challenging him with every breath puffing out of her nostrils. His hand slid up to cup the back of her head. She stiffened, inhaling sharply. "False kindness," he said, eyes flashing as his gaze roved over her face. His thumb swept across the apple of her cheek. "Have you not considered that perhaps I care about you? And not like one of my so-called academy dalliances?" Her lips burned, the memory of their earlier kiss seared there forever. But though his face was so close to hers, close enough that she could tiptoe and press her lips to his, and even though her eyes wanted to flutter shut, she swallowed and fought to clear her mind. "Does it matter?" she growled. "Does it matter when I cannot trust anything you do or say? Proclaim your undying love for me, Shikai, but I will not be moved. Not when I've seen your patterns of behavior." She abandoned her smile entirely, reaching up to place one hand on his chest. A threat, as she let her claws lengthen just slightly. Just enough for him to see them, to feel them if she pressed. "Take your hand off my face. I'm not about to be another girl you string along for fun. You may think it's fine to steal kisses whenever you like, but it's not fine by me." "Proclaim my undying love?" Kai scoffed, anger and other things smoldering in his eyes. "I didn't have to pay that fine your grandfather had accrued with the landlord in Sushui. You think I did that because I hate you and just want to take advantage of you? You didn't exactly give me a chance to be grateful. Will you now hold this over my head? Keep reminding me how good you are because you, the rich boy in town, decided to have mercy on a poor soul like me? I am grateful, Kai." She stopped, her voice breaking only slightly. "I don't know what I would have done. But you've gone and taken a good deed and made it ugly. Instead of being thankful, I'm furious. And so very confused." He broke their gaze, his jaw working as he stared toward the inn. She wasn't done, not until he fully understood how serious she was. "I'm your comrade, not a girl to be wooed. And if you ever try to kiss me again without my permission, don't think I won't take steps to protect myself." She should have stopped there, should have left her threat unspoken. But suddenly she was voicing the one thing she knew without a doubt would elicit a strong reaction from him. "Your brother wanted the name of Tsushui." He vanished so quickly she couldn't brace herself as he reappeared behind her and pinned her hard face first against the coarse wood of the stables. She gasped, his full weight pressing against her back. She immediately shifted her hands and tried to angle them for attack. The cold, cruel tip of a knife pressed against her neck. Aranya stilled. Her blood went cold for only an instant. Then it burst into a boiling rage. How dare he? How dare he? Strong reaction indeed.
"Since we are apparently threatening one another,"
Kai said smoothly, his mouth just above her ear. His voice took on an edge she'd never heard, harsh and potent.
"You will never contact any member of my family, for any reason, under any circumstance, and you certainly will not use them as blackmail over me. After what they did to you, I didn't think I'd have to say this, but here we are. Do I make myself clear, love?"
She growled low in her throat. He pressed into her harder, the blade tickling that place just below her jaw where her pulse throbbed.
That wasn't an answer.
You wouldn't hurt me, she snarled.
Wouldn't I?
It's illegal. He snorted, as if that was not the answer he expected. Then he whispered wickedly,
I have quite extensive experience getting away with doing things I shouldn't.
She struggled, trying to elbow him in the ribs, but he held her fast. He had one of her hands pinned against the wall. The other he gripped tightly. He didn't touch her chafed wrists.
I'm proposing a mutually beneficial agreement,
Kai said, not able to see how her realization sent a feral smile spreading across her face.
You will avoid my family at all costs, and I won't kiss you.
He paused, then added devilishly,
unless you want me to, in which case we can renegotiate the terms of our agreement.
Chealing spawn.
Agree?
He pressed the knife harder into her skin, but not enough to make her bleed. For all his posturing, he wouldn't hurt her. She growled again, but let her body go limp. Fine. Agreed. The pressure against her vanished. She whirled, yanking up her claws by instinct. But Kai was gone. Chapter 6.
This map that you saw in Gabe,
said Delon over breakfast the next morning.
Tell me more about it.
They'd risen early and found themselves the first to be seated on colored mats with bowls of congee in front of them. Candles flickered, illuminating the quiet lobby before the light of dawn streamed through the windows. Aranya had just taken a rather large mouthful. She set down her chopsticks, pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and swallowed swiftly. Then she shoved aside her bowl, laying her palms flat on the table. This is the ocean, she said, gesturing to the air off the edge of the table. This is Suguan. She poked her finger on the table's lip. Then she circled the bottom half of the table. This is Juninghai, and this upper half of the table is Butagan. Delon nodded, watching carefully. Kai, on the other hand, seemed much more interested in the contents of his bowl than her words, and she wasn't sure if he was tired or purposefully ignoring her after last night. This is Shawnette. Another poke at the table where the city would be roughly on her imaginary map. She listed several more cities she'd seen on the map, designating each one. There were routes from each of these cities, and several more that I can't remember, and they all converged here at Gabe. Her finger pressed into the wood. She dared a glance up at Kai to find his attention firmly fixed on his breakfast. Her jaw clenched. Then it went from Gabe up to Kaiduk, which apparently is a fortress on Butagan's side of the border.
You also saw the eldest princess, Princess Mei Ling, held captive at the Shi residence,
said Delon. Escorted by 3 brigands that I recognized, said Aranya. One of them was the illusionist Kai and I fought on the way to Suguan. Young said something about them staying too long in Shawnette, and one of them was a fire wielder. I can't help but wonder if it was the same fire wielder that destroyed the body we found outside of Shawnette while we were investigating Tuan Wan's disappearance.
It's possible,
said Delon, ignoring the way Kai set to eating more vigorously, as if the taste of food could block out the sound of his brother's name.
There is a strong likelihood, based on this information, that the princess is being taken to the fortress.
To Fong Tsedong, said Aranya. Delon dropped his chopsticks into his bowl and rubbed the bridge of his nose, letting out a great sigh.
I'd really hoped this wouldn't involve him.
Who is he? She pressed. I know he defected from the academy many years ago, that he's trying to muster Butagan troops, right?
We don't know much. He was apparently good friends with the queen while they were at the academy. I believe I heard a rumor of a conflict he had with His Imperial Majesty, who was the Crown Prince at the time. At some point, he defected. No one knew where he went until rumors and intelligence were leaked from Butagan that he'd become an influence there and was mustering the strength to broach an attack on the Empire.
Seems foolhardy to me, said Aranya. An academy dropout trying to take over the largest empire in the world. Delon's eyes snapped to hers, arresting her with sudden force.
Thinking like that will get yourself killed and others with you. Never underestimate your enemies.
He was right, she knew, but that didn't stop the bolt of embarrassment to her stomach. She lowered her gaze and nodded, dragging her bowl back in front of her and continuing to eat. Her congee was suddenly tasteless and hard to swallow. Kai's eyes were heavy on the side of her face, but she refused to look at him. Delon let out a long exhale.
It looks like we're operating under the rough assumption that our main enemy is Feng Tsedong, and he has successfully convinced powerful Junning High wielders to defect with him, based on the traps left on the trail, and the spelled vines that Young used to bind Aranya.
The mention of those bindings made her wrists and ankles ache even more, despite the salve taking the edge off the pain last night. Now they were bandaged somewhat sloppily, since she'd done it herself. It would be a while before they fully healed.
The princess was a captive,
said Kai, breaking his silence.
What if the others were too? Evidence suggests otherwise, but we cannot rule out the possibility.
It would make more sense if Xuan Wan, Kang Lei, and possibly others left of their own volition, said Aranya. What use would someone like Feng have with them otherwise?
If Feng could subjugate ones as powerful as these wielders, especially Xuan Wan, then he would be a worthy foe indeed.
Delon turned to Kai, eyebrows lowering.
Are you certain you know nothing about your family's involvement?
Kai glared at him, took a deliberate mouthful, swallowed.
I know nothing. I have no idea why they would be in contact with Feng, or why the princess would be in their dungeon. No matter how they're involved, they're full-blooded traitors who must be stopped. What about the brigands?
Delon demanded.
Why did your family have brigands around?
Kai's jaw twitched, subtly. But all he said was,
every rich family uses brigands to do their dirty work.
He'd said something like that before, when they had rescued Lord Mong's daughter back in Sushui. Aranya frowned, glancing between the two men, her breakfast long forgotten. A silent battle seemed to wage before her, between Delon's narrowed gaze and Kai's lifted chin. The former no doubt looked for a shred of falsehood in the latter, but apparently he couldn't find any more than Aranya did. For all that Kai loved secrets, silence, and evasion, he was an honest person.
Our only option at this point seems to be to send a message to Suguan, informing them of the lead on the princess, and track them ourselves. She is our only lead now, so we recover the ground we lost getting Aranya's bonds off, head toward Kai Duk, and see if we can overtake those brigands before they reach Feng.
Delon set down his chopsticks, grabbed the bowl with both of his hands, and poured the rest of his congee into his mouth. Then he stood, groaning like an old man, slapped a few coins down onto the table, nodded at the innkeeper, and winced into the rising sun shining through the windows.
Time to ride,
he said.
If there was ever a blight on mankind, it was travel on horseback. Kai considered once or twice amputating a limb to disqualify himself from this mission. But despite how wonderful it would be to turn his horse around and ride back to Sushui, it seemed like it might be more hassle than it was worth. Probably. Trying not to let his eyes follow Aranya's movements as she dumped her saddlebags by the campfire was its own kind of torture. She was determined to ignore him, all while she engaged Delon in conversation every chance she had. He focused on brushing down his horse and hobbling its front legs. Horsehair was much coarser and dirtier than it looked from afar, when it shone like a polished stone. His horse stomped and twitched its head, flicking its mane and putting its ears back when he bent to hobble it. Irritable thing. "Wei Qi, during supper, anyone?" called Delan from where he was roasting rabbit over the fire. It turned out that having a feral wielder who could smell rabbits from what seemed several li away came in handy. Kai was tired of rice cakes and fish jerky. "Me," chirped Aranya. "Give me a minute to get these bandages retied. They keep coming loose." Of course they did, because she hadn't wanted to accept his help. Kai finished with his horse, giving it one last pat, and settled down by the fire opposite Aranya and Delan. He picked up one of the rabbit meat skewers Delan had made and held it over the fire. The juice dripped into the flames, sizzling and popping loudly. He stole a glance at Aranya. Her face bunched into knots as she fought with the bandages on her wrists. She'd mostly gotten the one on her left hand bound, though it looked like it might come undone during the night, with all the thrashing she did while she slept. He was not going to offer to help. She scowled as the bandage on her right wrist came unraveled for the third time in the last 30 seconds. "Cheelins," she cursed, and made to try again. Kai focused on the meat he was roasting. Not too much longer. "I give up," he sighed, putting down his skewer. "Fine." He'd offer, "Delan, would you help me?" Kai picked his skewer back up, trying not to scowl at the fire. In his periphery, Delan got up and knelt beside Aranya as she held out her wrist to him. "Every time I go to fasten it, it comes undone." "Quit your fidgeting and be still," said Delan, in that gruff sort of tone that Kai would imagine an affectionate father using to instruct his favorite child. "You didn't apply more salve." "I applied it last night." "Every day, shifter. Morning and evening. Otherwise it'll take you forever to heal, and we can't afford you to be disadvantaged." Kai propped up the skewer, then leaned over to rummage through his saddlebags. Aranya was still protesting when he pulled out the container of salve. "Catch," he said, and threw it before she turned to look. "Hey," she said, even as her hand flew out instinctively to catch it. She glared at him, the first time their eyes had met since breakfast. He only cocked one eyebrow, and then focused on grabbing another skewer and roasting it. "How many children do you have?" asked Aranya, rubbing the salve into her ankles haphazardly. The pain must have gone down since yesterday. 3. Delan set to bandaging her ankles, while she slathered salve onto her wrists. "Boys or girls?" "All girls." "All girls?" Aranya laughed, eyes sparkling in the campfire. "How old are they?" 11, 6, and 3. Delan couldn't seem to help but crack a smile as he worked. "Aw, how adorable. Are they wielders?" "The eldest is. She's a feral, like I am, and she's in her 5th year at the academy. We're still waiting to know about the younger two." "But you said you don't live in Suguan, right?" "That is correct." Delan let out a deep sigh, a line appearing between his eyes. "We do not get to be together as a family very often. Between her being at the academy and me traveling so much, it's difficult. But we make sure we're all in Suguan for the main festivals." He moved to her wrists, working slower now. At first, the thought of Delan with a passel of little girls clinging to him didn't seem to quite suit, but the more Kai thought about it, the more it suited perfectly. And Kai couldn't help but smile a little. It quickly faded. He didn't have to see Delan with his daughters to know he was a better father than Shimu had ever been to Kai. "That's my least favorite thing about the academy," said Aranya, fiddling with the salve stopper while Delan worked. "It takes you away from your family. It's hard being there alone, and I'm sure it's difficult for you as a father to send your daughter off by herself." That's why I make sure to visit her every time I'm in Suguan. And then, each time, I get a heart attack because she's grown up so much while I was gone. I'm afraid that if I don't visit often enough, I'll come by and I won't be able to recognize her anymore. Delan tied off the last bandage, returning to his spot by the fire. He picked up the skewer he'd cooked, handed it to Aranya, and grabbed another to roast. But then she crinkles her nose when she smiles, and I know I'd recognize her in the thickest festival crowd. Aranya's gaze was fixed on Delan, an understanding shining in her expression. I'm sure she loves having such a devoted father. Delan's nose twitched, probably from the strong smell of the cooking rabbit, and he said dryly, "She'd better. If not for me, she wouldn't even be alive." Aranya grinned. Kai looked down at his lap while he blew to cool off a bite of rabbit. "Ready for Wechi?" she asked suddenly, waving her skewer around and drawing Kai's gaze back up. "I think I figured out the secret strategy to demolishing you." Then she took a bite of rabbit, gasped at the heat, and set to fanning her open mouth. Delan's lips quirked. "Come on then, Shifter. Show me the secret strategy." Kai was glad they were friends. He was fine being ignored. Very, very fine. Finishing his supper, he grabbed his bedroll and laid down, setting his back to the sound of stones being placed on boards and Aranya's light-hearted chatter.
Chapter 7. They spent several days riding hard, stopping only after the sun was fully set. They were off again before it rose. This sort of endurance was what Aranya had trained her whole life for. But every morning when she dragged herself back to her horse, it wasn't the toning of her body that made it easier, but the strength of will she'd learned at the academy. Pain is in the mind, they'd told her. So she didn't complain despite the lack of sleep, the ache of her muscles and wounds, and Kai's cold silence.
Have you not considered that perhaps I care about you?
The words echoed in her mind as she determinedly ignored Kai as much as he ignored her. He was sure doing a fabulous job proving that he cared about her. Delan caught a scent. It was on the third day, after taking a rather treacherous pass to shorten their journey. Aranya had been too busy being glad her horse hadn't taken a wrong step and sent them hurtling into a deep ravine to listen carefully to what Delan was saying. It took her a second to tune in and find him describing one of the scent flavors as being similar to the blackening fire they'd encountered in Shawnet, and the other flavors could easily belong to the rest of their quarry. A thrill shot through Aranya. It was soon followed by restlessness and then boredom, when still several more days passed with no sign of the princess. The only good thing between all the grudges, irritation, and silence was when she got to take off the bandages on her wrists and ankles. Then one day, finally, Delan's nose suddenly shot up in the air. Aranya perked in her saddle and demanded, "What? What do you smell? Are we close?" He ignored her, his pupils focusing like pinpoints on the forest ahead of them. He kicked his horse faster, and she followed in suit. Kai took up the rear, not increasing his speed. "What?" she hissed as they proceeded. "What do you smell?"
"I think it's those brigands,"
Delan muttered, pulling his horse to a halt. He swung down from the saddle, hands automatically going to the weapons buckled on his belt.
"They're close. Aranya, you follow me for a better look. Kai, stay back in case things go wrong."
Kai said nothing. Aranya leapt out of the saddle, an insuppressible grin spreading across her face. Finally, something interesting. She drew her jian out of its holster, knocking a pair of arrows into the slots. No talons just yet. Delan kept sniffing the air, motioning for her to follow as he ducked under a low-hanging branch. Silently, she crept behind him. They moved swiftly, following his nose. Her blood thrummed with excitement, Would they be able to recover the princess? Delon glanced back at her, warning that they were close. She steadied her breathing, bringing her Jian up to firing position. He reached back, placing a hand on the top of the weapon and lowering it. He gave a quick shake of his head, and they kept moving. She swallowed her huff and followed him. Only a minute later, he held up his hand again. But this time, Aranya had already stopped. The sound of talking, of impatient huffing horses, drifted toward them. Moving with painstaking care now, they inched closer until she could make out swatches of color and movement through the foliage. She parted the branches a fraction of an inch, just enough to get a clear view. Immediately, she recognized the three brigands. There was a woman, her face and square form shrouded by a gray cloak. On the opposite side of the clearing stood that same tall illusionist she'd fought in the rain weeks ago. A third brigand with a jagged beard wrapped his meaty hands around the slight upper arm of a cloaked girl atop one of the horses. Princess Mei-ling? She wore no royal garments, only the drab, nondescript garb of a commoner. But there was no mistaking the grace with which she moved, the subtle elegance. Aranya was not a girl of refined taste by any means, but even she could tell the difference. Careless of hands bound behind her, the bearded brigand dragged the princess off her saddle and onto the ground. She landed hard, unable to catch herself. Delon winced, but Aranya's talons were already lengthening. Eyes widening, he reached out and gripped her arm. He shook his head, warning her. She barely caught herself from growling as she shifted away her claws and returned her gaze to the clearing. There were others. A few dressed similarly to the three brigands with the princess. But two more stood out to Aranya. They wore animal pelts, as though used to a much colder climate than Zhenninghai, with their hair tied in tight braids down their scalps. One had an axe strapped to his back, and both wore swords much longer and broader than the ones Kai and Delon carried. Aranya's throat went dry. They were from Butagan. Barbarians. The 8 warriors watched the girl on the ground as she struggled to her knees, no one bothering to help her. She said nothing, only spat out dirt and grass. But though she did not fight or protest, her eyes burned with passion, with anger. "Shu Zhen will catch up in a few days," the woman said to one of the unfamiliar brigands and the barbarians, gesturing at the silent illusionist. "He's got to tie up some loose ends. This is the last captive. She shouldn't give you trouble like the healer or that plant wielder. Tell the other groups that this is it, and we can head back to the fortress now." One of the other brigands, a short and stocky man, nodded and reached down to wrench the princess to her feet.
"Very well. Tie up those ends quickly. Fang will want you to return with us."
The illusionist nodded, a blank expression on his face.
"Just some trackers,"
said the bearded one.
"He'll take care of them."
He meant them. Aranya's insides clenched. Delon's face was like flint beside her. Captives. They just confirmed that Swan Wan and the healer were captives, not defectors. But why? And how? A few more words were exchanged, but Aranya was too focused on deciding which one to shoot first. As one of the brigands yanked the girl to another horse and hoisted her up roughly into the saddle, Aranya lifted her Jian. Delon shook his head, giving her a look of hot warning. She glared back at him as if to demand why. He only shook his head again and began backing out the way they'd come. She stayed, eyes wide with disbelief. They were just going to let them take the princess? They weren't going to intervene? She clenched her fists tightly around her weapon, fighting the urge to shift, fighting the urge to ignore Delon and shoot anyway. But she drew her impulses under control and eased out of the brush after her comrade. When they were finally out of earshot, she whirled on him. "We need to intervene. That was the princess. I'm sure of it."
And then what happens when we're outmatched 8-3? Assuming Kai came along in the nick of time, and they kill us all. No one will know where the princess is. Part of being a good wielder in the secret services is knowing when to pick your battles. We weren't going to win that one, and I don't know about you, but I have youngsters I want to go home to.
She paused, the knowledge of his correctness warring with her instinct to fight and save the princess. Reason warring with passion. They broke through a denser part of the forest, retracing their steps until the horses were visible again. "This changes everything," Aranya said.
"Keep your voice down. We don't know how close they are."
She lowered her voice but kept talking. "If Xuan and the healer were as captive as the princess, then doesn't it stand to reason that the rest of them likely were too? They didn't defect, they were captured. It would explain why it appears the same set of brigands performed many kidnappings in a short amount of time while still managing to get them back to this fortress. They had meeting points, essentially forming a bucket brigade of captives." Delon grunted in agreement. "Meeting points with barbarians."
"A very serious development indeed."
When they reached the horses, Kai was leaning against a tree, picking at his fingernails. Nearby, the horses grazed absently, tails swishing at flies.
"Anything interesting?"
he asked without looking up. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a pair of hands darted around the tree and grabbed Kai by the throat. His eyes bugged with shock, and then he vanished. They were moving in an instant. She and Delon both snapped up their Jians into firing mode, but she didn't have a chance to shoot before a hooded figure burst out from the trees, leaping on all fours like he was more beast than human. He pounced on Aranya. Her Jian went flying, knocked out of her grasp. She shifted her hands into claws. Scrape, slash, rip. Her talons tore into flesh, but the man only let out a cackling laugh, foam spewing out of his mouth onto her face. His weight wasn't what landed her on her back. He weighed so little she could have lifted him up in her arms. But his strength was so inhuman, so strange, so vicious. She could hardly fight when he slammed her into a tree trunk. Stars danced across her vision. A bony, gnarly hand clenched around her neck. She gasped, choked, as she was lifted off the ground, her feet kicking in midair. "Can't breathe, can't breathe." She sputtered, swiping with her claws uselessly at thin air as the brigand cackled through a snow-white beard. She kicked, fumbled to unsheath a knife. Her vision started to go black, but not before she saw the face under the hood. An ancient, decrepit man with maniacal eyes smiled at her. He wheeled back his arm, the one that held her, and she realized with sickening clarity that he intended to bash her head into the tree. She choked. An arrow landed straight in the old man's bicep. He let out a feral snarl, leaping to grab hold of Delon as his grip clenched tighter around Aranya's throat. He caught Delon by the front of his shirt and dragged his face close. The brigand let out a foam-gushing yell. Delon twisted his head away, reaching for a knife. Kai appeared on the brigand's back, his arm looping around his leathery throat. His other hand plunged a knife with lightning speed straight into the man's back. The brigand shrieked. Delon landed a powerful blow to his jaw. His grip loosened, and he dropped Aranya. She landed, rolling to her feet as her vision spun. The instant she was upright, she stumbled backward, but her foot knocked into something on the ground. With more instinct than clarity, she swept up her Jian and knocked an arrow. No time for two arrows. Kai stabbed the brigand again, his face a twisted grimace of strain. The brigand reached back, caught him by the leg, and ripped him forward. Kai let out a cry, only barely vanishing before the brigand slammed him into the ground. Then the brigand, bleeding from his multiple wounds, leapt for Aranya again. She gasped as she let her arrow fly. It hit his shoulder, but that didn't stop him from pouncing on her and knocking her clean to the dirt. He roared in her face. She screamed, throwing up a hand as spittle and blood landed on her skin.
"Don't you dare touch her!"
came Kai's vicious snarl. She didn't see much, only his swinging broadsword glinting in the sunlight, coming straight for the brigand's neck. Then the brigand let out another roar, snatching the blade, utterly heedless of how it sliced into his palm. He stopped the blow before it reached his neck. Instead, he redirected that momentum and shoved it down toward Aranya's throat. Kai let out a cry, which was abruptly cut off as he and his sword vanished. The sword came down again on the opposite side, aiming for the back of his neck. The old brigand, still pinning her, gave her a wild grin through his beard. He pushed off her, launching into the forest, blood trailing in his wake. The sword sliced empty air. All was suddenly quiet. Kai crouched beside her. "Aranya!" he gasped, reaching for her as she tried to prop herself up. His arm slid under her back, hoisting her up and against his chest. Her breaths came easier now, but her blood thrummed with adrenaline, with the need to fight, to chase. Dalan was already leaping around them in pursuit, his jian loaded. Aranya gasped, struggling to make her trembling limbs obey her. Then she realized her face was pressed against Kai's sweaty, heaving chest, and her forehead rested against the column of his neck. His arms were around her, shaking almost as much as her own. Something about it. A bolt of fear more terrifying than facing an insane brigand with feral strength hit her in the gut. She wasn't. This was too... Frantically, she pushed away from him, scrambling to her feet. His eyes were round, his mouth open, and his voice broke when he said, "Please, Aranya, don't..." She was already stumbling after Dalan, her cheeks burning as her neck swelled with more bruises. Her legs buckled beneath her, but she kept moving, following the trail of blood. Kept running until she ran straight into Dalan's face full of terror. "Run!" he cried, grabbing her arm and dragging her in the opposite direction, back to Kai. "What?" she cried back, trying to fight him.
"The whole lot of them are chasing us."
"We ought to fight them."
"Don't be an idiot."
Kai, who had already come after them, evanesced straight to the horses at the sight of their faces. He untethered all three with quick yanks on their leads, just in time for Aranya and Dalan to leap into the saddles. Together, the three of them tore off into the wilderness. They didn't slow their pace until Dalan was certain they had lost their pursuit. Their horses were panting, they were panting themselves, and they were forced to stop. Despite this, Dalan kept his nose in the air, his shoulders tense, as they dismounted.
"We need to get water for the horses,"
he said.
"I smell some this way. Follow me."
On foot, they guided their heaving horses after him. Aranya wasn't sure if she dared glance back at Kai, not after... She wrinkled her nose at herself. It was only her adrenaline, only the panic of that moment, that had made her think there was something in Kai's eyes earlier that she hadn't seen before. To prove to herself that everything was normal between them, she did glance back at him. He was already looking at her, eyes glowing too brightly. She swallowed quickly and hurried after Dalan. The fire crackled before them, the darkness so thick it almost hid the ridge of the bluff they camped near. Aranya had her chin propped up on her hands, her elbows resting on the knees of her crossed legs, trying to ignore how sore she was from head to toe. Kai stared emptily into the fire, and Dalan wasn't much better, at least until he started talking.
"We can't jump to conclusions,"
he said, then cleared his throat.
"But today we've confirmed that Lord Swan and the healer Leigh were captives, not defectors, and evidence seems to indicate they weren't the only ones to be kidnapped. At this point, it's a matter of why. Why kidnap these wielders?"
Aranya yawned, then shrugged. The healer is easy. She's the only person alive right now who can heal any ailment with a touch. Fong probably wants to use her for that.
"And if he can use her, then maybe he has a means of using the others,"
said Dalan grimly.
"Using our own against us."
Aranya nodded mutely, munching on a rice cake.
The barbarians change things, continued Delon. We're not just tracking brigands anymore, or even Fang Zedong. This is confirmation that Butagan means war, which means we are in a situation.
A situation?
We are 3 wielders. That crew heading north, presumably to Butagan and that fortress, is more than twice our size. So
we need to watch our backs and never let our guards down, said Aranya. She picked up a small stone and tossed it toward the edge of the bluff. Delon cast her a look.
You should be doing that already. What I'm saying is that one might make the case we ought to find the nearest city, send a missive to Suguan, and wait for further instructions.
Right then, the wind shifted and blew the smoke of the campfire straight into Aranya's face. She set into a fit of coughing, scooting away from the eye-watering fumes as her mind spun. They couldn't wait for instructions from Suguan. Absolutely not. That would set us back at least a week. We're in the middle of nowhere, and to wait for our message to arrive in Suguan and then wait for their response to reach us, it might even take several weeks.
It would.
And what about the princess? Aranya couldn't bear the thought of abandoning the princess to the heavy hand of her captors, regardless of her curse.
The princess makes this situation much more complicated.
We can't just leave her. If we go wait for instructions from the capital, we'll have let our only lead go. We're the only ones who have seen the princess since she was captured. We have to go after her.
We're outmatched,
said Kai, speaking for the first time in hours. Both Aranya and Delon turned to him in surprise.
What happens if we go after her and get killed because we're outnumbered, and then no one knows where the princess was?
Of course, Kai would take this opportunity to argue with her. She fixed her gaze firmly on Delon and let the flickering fire take up her periphery.
Both options are risky. Neither is preferred, and as far as I'm concerned, there's no clear right answer. We're justified in choosing to halt pursuit, send word to Suguan, and wait for further instructions. That would be the smart choice, considering the barbarians.
But it's the princess, said Aranya.
But it's the princess,
agreed Delon.
Outnumbered as we are, there is still a chance we could save her.
Kai looked up from beneath a lowered brow.
You're saying we should still go after her, despite the risks?
Delon cracked his knuckles.
I like myself a little risk here and there. Gets the blood pumping. And it makes me feel like I'm not nearly 40.
Oh, fathers, I was so afraid you'd say we couldn't go after the princess. Aranya beamed, relief settling the weight in her chest. Besides, if worse came to worse, we probably wouldn't do that badly against those brigands and barbarians.
Keep underestimating your enemies and I'll leave you behind,
said Delon sternly. Kai actually snorted at that, and when she shot a glare his way, he smiled at her. She blinked and quickly looked away. I'll take first watch, she said. Apparently, no one was in the mood for Wei Qi tonight. Chapter 8. Aranya nudged Kai awake with her boot. His sleep-softened face puckered, and a soft groan escaped his lips. Your watch, she whispered to avoid waking Delon. He nodded mutely, sitting up and wiping the sleep from his eyes. He stared blankly into the fire for a long minute, then glanced at her. For a second, she hesitated, as though she had something to say. But she didn't, right? She turned away before anything stupid came out of her mouth. Good night, she whispered, laying down on her bedroll and curling up into a ball. The exhaustion was so heavy, her body so sore, that the thick dullness of sleep quickly descended upon her. So tired. She was on the blink of oblivion when whispered words wove into her mind.
I'm sorry, Aranya. I'm sorry I kissed you. Truly sorry.
Something about that voice, so near, so low. Her brow pinched in confusion. But she was too close to sleep to process any of it. The speaker, the meaning, the implications. It was the one thing keeping her from drifting beyond awareness, that voice. Then something warm touched her face. Aranya was suddenly wide awake and in motion. Instinct made her slam her arm against her assailant, rolling her weight into him. Caught off guard, he fell backward. She continued her momentum, moving and shape-shifting her hands until she straddled his waist, claws around his neck. It was Kai. Her sleep-fogged mind cleared, her eyes widening. He held up both hands in surrender. Aranya snarled, tightening her claws around his neck. He didn't resist. "What are you doing?" she spat, keeping her voice low to not wake Delon. "7 Valleys! You scared the daylights out of me!" He grinned. Belatedly, his words registered in her mind. His apology for kissing her. A real apology. But instead of making her soften, it made her even more furious. "Apologize to my face, Shikai, not when I'm asleep." "Apparently you weren't asleep," he said, one eyebrow cocked. She stared at him as she held her claws against his vulnerable skin. Then realization hit her like a bolt of lightning, and it must have been written across her face because his grin went lopsided. He wasn't evanescing away from her. "Cheeling spawn," she growled, climbing off him. Kai only grinned wider, and the sight made her angrier and, strangely, happier at once. She hated watching him brood all the time, and he'd been nothing if not brooding ever since they'd escaped his family's house. Still growling under her breath, she moved back to her bedroll and yanked her cloak around her. "Let me sleep." "I'm sorry," he blurted. She paused, twisting to look at him over her shoulder. His smirk was gone, replaced by something much more honest, more vulnerable. "You're right," he said. "I should have apologized to your face. I'm sorry, Aranya. I shouldn't have used your situation with your grandfather like that. I'm sorry. And I hope you'll forgive me." Her mouth opened, but this time no words came out. Instead, she stared at him, hardly believing Shikai was actually apologizing to her. He stared back, his gaze unflinching, probably reading all her thoughts. She stuttered, opening and closing her mouth. Then, finally, one cohesive thought formed enough in her mind for her to speak. "Why did you pay the fine?" He sat up, hooking his elbow around his propped knee. With his other hand, he tore up bits of grass. "I overheard the conversation you had with our landlord. I saw you two talking, Evanesce behind the door, and listened. Then I left before either of you could find me. You couldn't pay it. The fine wasn't your fault. I had the money, so it wasn't all that much." "Not much for you," she laughed ruefully. He pursed his lips. "Wealth can be a curse as easily as a blessing." "You mean to say that when I went to talk to Leigh, the landlord, the next morning, you'd already paid it?" He nodded, not looking at her. "But I thought you would perhaps be offended. That's why I asked Leigh to tell you the deadline was extended." There was a long pause, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the crickets of the forest. Kai stood, stepping away to his post. "I'll let you sleep," he said quietly. She bit her lip, blinking, watching him. If he had apologized to her face, she could thank him to his. Drawing a deep breath, she said softly, "Thank you for paying that fine, Kai. I honestly had no idea what I was going to do." Kai stopped, his back to her. After the silence lasted a few breaths, he turned enough that the profile of his smirk was visible. His dry voice carried across the fire. "I'd say any time, but you sure rack up the fines quickly. I'd be bankrupt before the Festival of New Lights." "Why do I bother?" she muttered, rolling over and pulling the blanket over her head. His quiet chuckles drifted over to her. Chapter 9.
Kai was lighter than he'd been in days. Having Aranya accept his apology was like a sack of rice off his chest, despite the constant worry about his family and the ever-present guilt over what had happened in Gabe. The long travel days were grueling. Despite their earlier spotting of the princess, Delan had yet to catch the brigand's scents. They kept their pursuit north, toward the Butagan fortress, in hopes that they would come across her again, or possibly even reach the fortress before the princess did, if that was even possible. There was always the chance they might stumble across the other Secret Service wielders, who pursued the trails of the rest of the missing wielders. If that happened, then they'd be more equipped to launch an attack on the brigands, should they discover them again. But so far, it was just the three of them and the endless Jenning High wilderness. Kai tried not to sneak glances at Aranya that were too obvious. Currently, she was looking at Delan, her lips parted, like she wanted to say something, before her eyes darted to Kai's. He met her gaze evenly. She flushed and looked away. He couldn't help the curl of satisfaction in his stomach. She chewed her lip, looking again to Delan, who lifted his eyebrows and sighed loudly. "If I've told you once, I've told you a dozen times," he said. "Traveling isn't a social event." Kai smirked, though he remained silent. "But that makes traveling so boring," Aranya cried. "You shun me all day, and then when we camp I'm not supposed to talk? When am I supposed to have a regular human interaction?" Kai's smile was less smirk and more amusement. If only Delan was somewhere else right now, then he could more openly tease her, maybe rile her into a tizzy of feigned outrage. Scowls shouldn't elicit delight, but, well, here they were. He wanted to kiss her again. No. He couldn't think those thoughts. He gritted his teeth and reached up to scratch the back of his neck. Delan rolled his eyes. "The idea is that we're professionals, and we don't need regular human interaction. We're able to thrive under harsh, strenuous circumstances while on a mission." Aranya scowled. "We're not required to starve ourselves while on a mission to prove we're so rugged. Is it so terrible that I want to have a 5-minute conversation once in a while?" "Once in a while," Kai snorted. She glared at him. He lifted both hands, palms up. "I'll talk to you, if you want." Delan shot him a sidelong glance, a warning potent in every line of his face. Kai merely shrugged, stuffing one hand into the pocket of his robes, and failed at wiping the smirk off his face. Aranya looked between them both, as though trying to read Delan's silent admonishment. "My offer stands," Kai said dryly. She flushed red and looked away, which was definitely not the reaction he'd expected. He stared at the back of her head, confused, until he remembered the last time he'd said something similar, when they were staying at that inn and he was offering to share that cramped bed with her. He ducked his head and clamped his mouth shut so he didn't laugh aloud. Delan straightened suddenly, nose stuck sharply into the air, to their left. "What?" Aranya sat up in her saddle, tightening her grip on her reins. Delan's face was grim. "Kai, I'm going to need you to check on something," but before he could finish, the shrieking of bells cut through all thought, all conversation, all except the sudden, terrifying realization. Kai turned horrified eyes to Aranya, finding hers the size of saucers in her pretty face. In a flash, they dismounted, the unspoken agreement about their responsibility as magic wielders of Jenning High. Aranya and Dalan had their jians loaded. Kai had his broadsword drawn. With one last glance toward each other, they broke into a run. Kai evanesced ahead, wary of the trees. In a few short leaps, he reached the source of those bell-like brays, and very nearly evanesced right back at the sight of a full Chileen herd.
When Aranya reached the clearing, she could hardly process what she saw. Everywhere, cacophony. Fire sizzled in every direction, color flashing like jewels and precious metals each way she turned. So many. She lifted her jian and fired. Her aim was wide, and though she hit the beast, it was not a killing blow. The Chileen roared, rearing back on cloven hindquarters and billowing fire from its maw. Enormous antlers struck low-hanging tree branches. Its glass-like eyes focused on her as she whipped out more arrows, reloading them as fast as her hands could move. But before she could fire again at the beast before her, another came charging for her, one she hadn't been watching. The gleam of its scale-like hide reflected sunlight so bright it was nearly blinding. She didn't have time to throw up her hands to protect her eyes. She lifted her weapon and shot into the whiteness flooding her vision. Screams told her she'd hit her target, but there was no earth-shuddering thud of one falling. The reflected light shifted as the Chileen reared back, and it was just enough for her to see that the other one was charging for her. Her breath lodged in a knot. She leapt to the side, rolling up to her feet again as it skidded past her. Another charged at her, its beard burning and dripping fire. So many. How could they ever— Then a different jian pointed over her shoulder, and the charging Chileen fell.
"I've got your back,"
Dalan called.
"Watch mine."
Relief flooded her, followed by a burst of determination like fire in her blood. She squared her shoulders, bumping into Dalan's back as they each took up firing stances and aimed at the beasts opposing them. They shot, reloaded, and shot again. Sweat poured down Aranya's forehead, stinging her eyes as she aimed.
"How many?"
Dalan called. "There's too many to count."
"No! How many have you killed?"
he shouted. 4 so far?"
"I'm beating you. 7 down."
She couldn't help the grin that split her face as she reloaded and fired to her left, hitting another. "That's 5, she called. A new noise filled the deafening discord. This one was deeper, rumbling through the ground, a bell that sounded bigger than the forest surrounding them. It rattled her ribcage, sending fear dousing through her blood. Stomping hooves shook the world, unsteadying her knees. Aranya lowered her jian, eyes painfully wide, as she lifted them to the opposite side of the clearing. At first, all she could see was shadow. Where there had once been light and sun, there was nothing but dark and night. Snorting breaths filled the clearing, and the brightly colored, fearsome Chileens backed away, their own bell-like cries damping from a roar to a whine. Dalan's presence at her back vanished. She jerked her head toward him as he stepped to his side, his face iron-hard and eyes blazing.
"This,"
he growled, reaching out and snatching her elbow,
"is when we run."
"Where's Kai?" Dalan's eyes darkened.
"I don't know."
"We can't leave until we know he's safe."
"He's fine. He's an Evanescer."
"That does not mean he's fine. It means he's probably fine. We must be sure." Dalan ignored this comment, turning on his heel as fire sparked in the depths beyond the trees, where a huge presence lumbered closer. He dragged Aranya after him.
"Run!"
he cried.
"We'll worry about Kai later."
But the moment they broke into a run, they skittered to a halt. Not 10 paces away, 3 Chileens stared at them, gold, emerald green, and iridescent white. Their eyes were emotionless pools of black glass, lethal and shimmering. Aranya took a step back, glanced over her shoulder. More Chileens waited there, also staring. The breath fled her chest in a soft gasp. They weren't attacking. But they certainly were threatening. Waiting for their alpha.
"Wherever Kai is," Delon growled, "he's in a better position than we are."
The heavy breathing from the approaching shadows was louder than the shrieks of the Chelines. It billowed like a gust of wind over the glittering bodies they'd already slaughtered. As one, the Chelines surrounding them took a step closer. Then, Aranya could do naught but stare, her head tilting backward, as the alpha emerged from the forest. Her hand holding her jian drifted down to her side, only the barest instincts maintaining her grip on the weapon. He was the color of deep night. His beard, his hide, the tree-sized antlers protruding from his brow were like polished ebony stone, sharpened to deadly points. His eyes were gleaming ink, so pigmented they would stain anything they looked upon. Even the fire that billowed from its gaping maw was black. Burning smoke. He was majestic, his mane sucking the sunlight out of the world. He was death. Aranya's mouth gaped open, her neck craned, her feet like stumps rooted several li deep into the earth. She had no mind for the Chelines surrounding them, nor for Delon at her side. It was only her and this monster. Her and her death. The beast snorted, blasting air into her face. It stomped one hoof, but she couldn't drag her gaze down from its terrifying face to see that its hooves were the size of small boulders. It snorted again, this time spattering black fire droplets. One landed on her cheek, the other on her arm, burning through her sleeves instantaneously. The searing pain scorched her skin down to her very soul, and the scream that burst from her rent the air in two. It broke the spell. Aranya stumbled back, nearly dropping her jian as pain lanced through her. Her scream turned to a hiss, snapping her gaze from the monster to her burned arm. Delon cried out too. The sound made her blood turn to fire, her fear to rage. This was not how they were going to die. Not from a mere breath from a fire-dripping moagwe. No, she wasn't leaving Ye for this. She didn't care if it was 1,000 feet tall, or whether it was a nightmare incarnate. This was not her death. She yanked her jian up and shot straight at the beast. Her tiny arrows couldn't miss, he was so huge. They hit his throat, and the blood that spurted from the wound was not black, but glittering molten gold. The alpha reared back, its thunderous roaring knocking them to the ground. Black fire billowed into the sky. She vaguely heard Delon scream her name, but was already loading another pair of arrows. The beast landed back on all fours, and the impact of its front hooves hitting the ground sent Aranya flying. She landed hard in the dirt, looking up in time to see the monster drawing in a deep breath. She felt the rush of air pulling her toward its mouth, readying to spew decimating fire at them. Then there was a new sound. One of tiny tinkling bells. A whole chorus of whimpering, whining chimes cutting through the rumbling, ear-splitting roars around her. She rolled over, pushing up on her elbows. Her talons dug into the earth. When had she shifted? Her jian had landed just out of reach. She bit back a snarl as the high-pitched bells grew louder, more insistent. Crawling forward, she strained to reach her weapon. The surrounding herd of the Chelines' ears perked, and even the alpha swung its giant head to the side. Before she had time to prepare herself, a small herd of Cheline calves stampeded through the clearing. Aranya screeched in surprise, rolling several times until she dragged herself up behind a tree to avoid being flattened. She saw a flash of a tall figure she recognized, wielding a hefty branch and shouting, "Hiya!" at the calves. The noise that erupted around her from the entire herd sent her curling up in a ball, pressing hands over her ears. In a not completely rational moment, she let her own screams join the uproar, as if it would keep her ears from splitting in half. The ground rumbled, shaking under the pounding of hooves. Aranya scrambled further against the tree she hid behind, pressing her head between her knees as she felt how near the Chelines stampeded past her. She was a pebble falling over the edge of a waterfall, drowning in the roar as the world fell to pieces. Then, quiet. Around her, the air whined with silence. The ringing of bells slipped into something that was either memory or confusion, and she had only enough strength to melt against the tree. Then someone was gripping her shoulders, shaking her. "Aranya! Aranya! Are you alive?" Her eyes fluttered open, her vision clearing at the sight of beautiful, light brown eyes staring back at her, ringed in white. The lines of Kai's face were drawn so tightly, so frantically, that she smiled at him kneeling before her. "I'm alive," she croaked. Kai's head sagged between his shoulders, his grip on her going lax with relief. It was only a brief moment. For the next, he was reaching for her face. Aranya yelped and tried to scoot backward more, only succeeding in bumping into the tree. "No kisses!" she shrieked, scrambling away. "You're burned," he said, knocking her hand away and gingerly touching her cheek near the wound. She scowled and pushed him back, stumbling to unsteady feet. "It's better than being dead." "Where were you?"
"In case anyone's wondering, I'm alive too,"
Delon's voice called from the clearing.
"Not that I would want anyone to worry too much about me."
"Delon!" Aranya cried, leaping away from Kai. Delon grunted, shifting himself against a tree. He scowled, sweat dripping off his brow.
"I never, ever, ever want to see one of those things again."
"Are you hurt?" she asked. She winced at her own pain as she crouched next to him, half reaching out a hand. "Where did it burn you?"
"It's no big deal,"
he snapped. His dark eyes darted from Aranya to Kai, standing behind her.
"Glad you decided to stop by for a spot of tea."
Kai closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath. She waited for him to growl something about saving their lives, but instead he swallowed and said in a surprisingly earnest tone, "I'm so sorry. It was harder than I expected to herd the calves this way. Had I known, I would have stayed and fought with you."
"And died with us,"
Delon grumbled. He released a great sigh, his shoulders sagging as he covered his eyes with his hand.
"As mad as I am, your thinking was quick. I want to be furious, but well done. We both owe you our lives. But next time, for the Father's sakes, communicate with us before you vanish without a trace."
Kai's eyes dropped to the ground.
"We ought to tend wounds before heading out. I'll evanesce to the horses and bring them back with the medical supplies."
He vanished, leaving Aranya to turn her attention back to Delon. "You look like you're in a lot of pain."
"Oh, I'm mostly banged up and bruised. I only collected a handful of burns and a nick on the arm from the horns. What about you?"
"I think I fared a little better," she said as she began rolling back his sleeve to expose the trickling wound.
"Shocking, considering the idiotic move you pulled at the end."
She looked up and couldn't help her grin. "I wonder how many people have landed shots at Chilean alphas and lived to tell the tale."
"I can assure you, you're probably the sharpest one of the few who have,"
he growled. She paused, tilting her head. Is that an insult or a compliment? She hadn't realized how tense she was, how worried she was, until Delon smirked. Relief washed down her spine, making her answering smile the most genuine she'd smiled in a while.
"You decide, little shifter."